So the second precept we're working with today, the traditional translation into English is, I undertake the precept to refrain from taking that which is not given. So that which is not given, an important framing. Some of the other translations talk about it as the precept against stealing, against taking. So this has always been an interesting one to me, because there's the actual act of stealing, knowing that somebody else has this property or somebody else owns this item, and one is going to knowingly take it. I want that one. I don't want to have to pay for it or buy it myself. I'm going to just take it, and then I'm going to have it and I'll feel good. I mean, I'm not sure how they feel about the stealing, but I think the accumulating of items feels good to that person. It's another way that we try to fill the sense of deficit, the deficit of the core wound that we carry at our core, that sort of nagging energy of not being enough, not being good enough, not being smart enough, not being whatever enough. And a lot of people have a conclusion from that of a kind of lack of value or worthlessness about them, is how that runs. So it's trying to accumulate things to get stuff without having to pay or have a cost. I think where this precept gets more interesting is the taking what is not given. So even like if something is left, you're in a public space and something is sitting out, how do we know that it's something that's free to take, or whether there's someone is set it down there for a short time to do something else? And at what point is it, are we taking what seems to be abandoned versus stealing? And that gets really interesting, I think, to me, where if we really apply this to not taking, I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, but not taking what is not given. So avoiding whatever isn't freely given. And that's why on Buddhist retreats, when items are put out, a lot of times there'll be a sign to say, free, please take one, or something like that. So there's a clear message that whatever the item is, it's available. Or at some retreat centers, they have it where they have items, for example, various personal care items, or things like aspirin, etc. And they have some dana box for it, so some type of an exchange for it. So clearly that's being given, but there's an expectation or a hope of an offer of dana, of generosity, so meaning money, as a reimbursement for that item. So it's an interesting idea. We think about humans taking what's not given. We can do this in relationships as well. We can overstep the relationship or mistakenly read more into it than is there. And if we really start working with this, it gets very interesting, really checking in with other people to see what's actually being given before we start taking. And that can lead to some interesting conversations, helpful conversations about where the boundaries are in relationship and how comfortable someone is giving or not giving. And of course, there are people that have a very hard time giving. They really feel as though there's not enough in the world, and so they tend to have a hoarding tendency to accumulate and not get rid of things. Other people have the flip side, where they get rid of everything and anything they can. I knew somebody who was like that, where if you visited their house, really if you almost set something down, this person was thinking, well, maybe this is abandoned. They want to get rid of this. So you had to be careful at their house to put your stuff away, or to let the person know that you were temporarily setting it down. It wasn't being rejected. So that was an interesting personality trait also, this kind of aversion of just getting rid of everything. Anyway, so that's the normal way that the precept is seen. I'm curious how that strikes you, particularly taking what is not given. How does that land? How would you see that in everyday life, in your experience? Well, that brings in an interesting twist, is necessity, survival. I know for myself, whenever I've heard about somebody stealing food who their family had nothing, had no money, no food, no jobs, I definitely tend to have a different reaction than in somebody stealing who has things or could pay for it but prefers not to. So that's, when survival tied into it, or particularly if there's somebody's trying to take food for children who aren't being able to eat, that seems like a different instance to me anyway. Yeah, that's an interesting, what you're introducing is interesting, the idea, because people do say that a lot. I don't know if that's true in every culture, but I know here in the States it's common. People will say, make yourself at home. And I think people mean that to some extent, meaning relax and get what you need. But on the other hand, I think there's also limits to that. People are saying, well, within certain boundaries, whatever the boundaries are, but they're unspoken. And that might depend on culture. Like I know here in the Midwest of the U.S., I've relocated here about 6 years ago. And if you go to visit somebody here, you always bring a sweet carb. You bring a pie or some kind of breakfast, pastry, but you never come empty-handed. It's always something, you bring something like that. And that's just a norm. If you don't bring it, then people sort of feel a little weird. So that's an interesting cultural norm I've had to adjust to also, both having people visit and also visiting other people. So there's lots of social norms. And I like what you introduced also, Bill, the idea about someone taking credit for another's work, which happens a lot at workplaces. I've seen that a lot when I used to work as a lawyer. The more senior lawyers would often take credit for the work of the junior lawyers who had, done it all. And then there are people who will steal credit from other people at work. I've heard of those folks as well, where they didn't do it, but they'll let people think they did. So that's another form to me of stealing. You're taking what's not being given. Yeah, I was going to say one last example. I knew someone that lived in South Korea a number of years ago. And at the time, they had these various exams that kids in school needed to take at, I don't know, say at the different levels, finishing elementary school and junior high school and high school. And if you passed with a certain grade, you would go on in school. So they wanted to essentially reward and recognize those who were academically smart and open academic doors for them. And those who did not do well would be relegated to work commensurate with that level of education. So if somebody didn't pass the elementary school test, for example, they would be relegated to being perhaps a maid in a hotel or a garbage person or something, fairly basic. And then with each level, more job opportunities would come available to those folks. And at the time, there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of bribery to get test results, to get answers, so that parents could make sure their kids would have a more economically satisfying life. And in one instance, the person who was in charge was being bribed for the answers, didn't have time to get the answers to the people bribing him. And so he had the test manufacturers put in bold the letter that was the correct answer. So if there was a problem and there was A, B, C, D, if D was the answer, that would be bold, and the others would be in a lighter font, I guess, or shade. And of course, that led to this person being caught, because after a while, the kids figured it out and they had amazing scores on that test, as you can imagine. And interestingly and sadly, when the head of the education department or whatever it was found out and revealed to have taken bribes and been part of this cheating, because of the social shame, he committed suicide. And I thought, boy, what an incredible burden if you're going to move into things like bribery and falsifying test scores and such. That's sort of one thing, but to have a cultural norm that if you get caught, you've got to kill yourself, really put it at a level that was pretty shocking to me as a Westerner. And I don't really have a reconciliation on the story, but I think it's interesting that even in different cultures, they can manage this differently, and other aspects can come into where if you're caught stealing in some of those cultures, it can be quite devastating. I think that's true in other countries as well, where they have very severe penalties. In some of the Middle Eastern countries, I think there's some quite severe punishments for things like stealing, taking what is not given.